when an empath absorbs the narcissist's darkness and survives. Carl Jung discovered they don't just heal, they transform into something the narcissist never saw coming. The person who once absorbed every projection becomes untouchable. The soul that carried everyone's shadow develops an immunity to manipulation. And most shocking of all, their very presence begins to force others to face the darkness they've been projecting. Picture this moment. You've carried their rage, their shame, their emptiness until you could barely recognize yourself. You've been the emotional dumpster for their unprocessed pain, while they walked away clean, leaving you to sort through the wreckage of their inner world. But something shifts, not with anger or drama, but with a quiet, terrifying clarity. You stop explaining yourself to people who were never listening. You stop absorbing emotions that were never yours. Most devastatingly of all, you become unavailable for their emotional emergencies. Jung called this process individuation, but what I call the birth of psychological sovereignty. And what emerges from this transformation isn't the same person who entered the narcissist's web. It's an entirely new archetype that Jung understood could reshape every relationship around them. But here's what most people don't understand about this transformation. It doesn't happen through therapy sessions or self-help books. It happens through what Jung called the night sea journey, a descent into psychological hell that breaks you so completely that only your authentic self remains. The empath who survives this journey becomes something Jung documented but rarely spoke about in public. They become what I call the shadow walker, someone who has stared into the abyss of human darkness and returned with their light intact but fundamentally changed. Jung wrote, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." The empath-narcissist dynamic is this inferno. It's a psychological crucible that either destroys you or transforms you into something unprecedented. This isn't just recovery, this is evolution, the kind of consciousness upgrade that Jung believed was essential for humanity's psychological development. And the narcissist, in their desperate hunger to consume your soul, accidentally becomes the catalyst for your greatest transformation. They think they're destroying you, but they're actually forging you into something unbreakable. Jung spent decades studying what he called psychological types, and he noticed something disturbing about highly sensitive individuals. They become what I call shadow containers, unconsciously programmed to absorb the psychological waste that others refuse to process. Jung wrote, "The healthy man does not torture others. Generally, it is the tortured who turn into torturers." But empaths represent a third category, the ones who absorb the torture without becoming torturers themselves. This creates what Jung termed participation mystique, an unconscious merger, where the empath can't distinguish between their emotions and absorbed projections. The narcissist exploits this vulnerability ruthlessly, using the empath's sensitivity as an emotional dumping ground. But here's where Jung's insight becomes crucial. He discovered that this exploitation serves an evolutionary purpose. Jung wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown." The empath-narcissist dynamic forces this outgrowing in the most brutal way possible. It's consciousness evolution through trauma, psychological development through crisis. The narcissist represents what Jung called the shadow denied, all the darkness they refuse to acknowledge about themselves. The empath becomes the repository for this denied shadow, but in carrying it, they begin to understand shadow in ways that fundamentally alter their perception of reality. Jung believed that consciousness evolves through conflict, and the empath-narcissist dynamic is one of the most brutal consciousness accelerators known to psychology. The empath doesn't just witness this shadow material, they're forced to carry it until they develop what I call shadow literacy, the ability to read psychological darkness like a native language. If you've ever felt like you were carrying someone else's emotional baggage, comment, "I was their shadow container." Jung documented what he called the dark night of the soul. But for empath, in narcissistic relationships, this becomes what I call the shadow immersion experience. You don't just witness darkness, you're forced to live inside it. The narcissist's projection doesn't just hurt, it rewrites your internal narrative. Their shame becomes your self-doubt. Their rage becomes your anxiety. Their emptiness becomes your depression. You literally absorb their psychological toxins until your own identity dissolves. Jung called this psychological poisoning, and he wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." But for empaths, this pain isn't just personal, it's collective. You're processing shadow material that belongs to generations of unresolved trauma. The narcissist forces you into what Jung called the negrito, the blackening phase of psychological alchemy, where everything dissolves into chaos. Jung wrote, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. But finding that order requires surviving the disorder first." But here's what Jung discovered about this poisoning process. The psyche has an immune system. When foreign psychological material is forced into your consciousness, your authentic self begins to develop what I call shadow antibodies that recognize manipulation at a cellular level. This is why the empath's transformation is so profound. You don't just learn about manipulation intellectually. Your nervous system develops a visceral rejection response to psychological toxicity. Jung wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." The empath who survives narcissistic abuse has made more darkness conscious than most people encounter in a lifetime. You become what Jung called a wounded healer, but not in the traditional sense. You're wounded by someone else's unconscious shadow, but you heal by making that shadow conscious. Jung observed, the most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. This is exactly what happens to the empath who survives. They develop an unshakable inner peace born from having faced the worst and survived. Jung studied what he called ego death, the moment when your false sense of self collapses completely. For empath surviving narcissistic abuse, this death is particularly brutal because their entire identity was built around being helpful, understanding, and emotionally available. The breaking point isn't dramatic. It's quiet, terrifying. You wake up one morning and realize you don't recognize the person in the mirror. Your empathy feels dead. Your hope feels poisoned. Your ability to trust feels shattered beyond repair. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But for the empath at rock bottom, there seems to be no self left to accept. You've absorbed so much foreign psychological material that your authentic self has been buried alive. This is what Jung called the negrito, the blackening phase of psychological alchemy, where everything that seemed solid dissolves into chaos. Jung observed, "We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." But accepting this psychological death feels impossible when you don't even know who's doing the accepting anymore. You've been so focused on everyone else's inner world that you've lost contact with your own. But here's what Jung understood about this dissolution that changes everything. He wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." This choice only becomes possible after the false self dies completely. The old self must die completely before the authentic self can emerge. And the narcissist, in their relentless attack on your identity, accidentally becomes the destroyer of your false self. The constructed identity based on pleasing others and avoiding conflict. This is why I call narcissists unwitting shamans. They perform a psychological dismemberment that forces individuation in ways that decades of therapy might never achieve. Jung wrote, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." The narcissist pushes you so far into psychological nonsense that you're forced to find your own sense. In this darkness, something ancient awakens. Jung called it the self, the archetype of wholeness that exists beneath all conditioning. The empath discovers they are not their trauma, not their absorbed emotions, not their compulsive giving. They are something far more powerful. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But for most people, this privilege remains theoretical. The empath who survives narcissistic abuse doesn't just understand this quote, they embody it at a cellular level, because they've been stripped of every false identity. Jung was fascinated by alchemy because he saw it as a metaphor for psychological transformation. The empath's journey follows what Jung called the opus contra naturam, work against nature that produces something entirely new. What emerges from this psychological crucible isn't the same empath who entered the relationship. It's what I call the integrated empath, someone who maintains their sensitivity but surrounds it with unreachable psychological boundaries. Jung documented this transformation in his concept of the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create something entirely new from the union of opposites. The empath who survives has integrated their shadow and their light, their victim and their victor, their wound and their wisdom. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But here's the difference. The narcissist remains unconscious while the empath becomes hyperconscious. This integration creates what Jung called psychological sovereignty, but what I call shadow immunity. You become literally immune to manipulation because you've developed the ability to see psychological projections before they land. It's like developing night vision after being forced to live in complete darkness. The narcissist's tactics that once destroyed you now roll off like water off glass. Not because you've become hard, but because you've become conscious. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The transformed empath has made manipulation tactics conscious, which renders them powerless. You can see the strings before the puppet show even begins. But here's where the transformation becomes truly powerful. The integrated empath doesn't just resist manipulation. Their very presence disrupts it. Jung called this the constellation effect. When one person's consciousness level affects everyone around them, Jung observed, as far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. The transformed empath becomes this light, not the naive light that gets consumed, but the fierce light that exposes shadows wherever it shines. Comment if you've reached the point where manipulation attempts feel obvious and ineffective. I see through the matrix now. Jung spent years documenting archetypes, universal patterns of human experience, but he identified one archetype that emerges only through extreme psychological testing, what I call the shadow walker, someone who has journeyed into psychological hell and returned with forbidden knowledge. The shadow walker archetype embodies what Jung called the wounded healer, but with a crucial difference. Traditional wounded healers heal others through their wounds. Shadow walkers heal others through their wholeness. Jung wrote, "Everyone you meet knows something you don't know but need to know. Learn from them." But the shadow walker has learned something most people actively avoid learning: how to navigate the darkest aspects of human psychology without being consumed by them. You become living proof that psychological sovereignty is possible. Your very existence threatens the unconscious contracts that keep people trapped in dysfunctional patterns. Jung observed, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. This is why your presence becomes so disruptive after transformation. You're no longer participating in the collective unconsciousness that Jung identified as the root of human suffering. You've stepped outside the matrix of projection and manipulation. Jung wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. The shadow walker has won this struggle completely. You've developed what I call tribal immunity, the ability to maintain your individual consciousness even when surrounded by group unconsciousness. But this victory comes with isolation. Jung called it the loneliness of the individuated. The price of consciousness is separation from the unconscious masses." Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." Yet this loneliness isn't empty. It's full of authentic self-connection that most people never experience. You discover that being alone with your true self is infinitely preferable to being surrounded by people who only see your projections. Jung observed, "To be normal is the ultimate aim of the unsuccessful." The shadow walker has transcended the need to be normal because they've discovered something far more valuable: the ability to be real. Jung discovered that highly individuated people become what I call consciousness mirrors. Their presence forces others to see themselves clearly, often for the first time. The transformed empath becomes this type of mirror, but unlike the passive mirrors they once were, reflecting back what others wanted to see, they now reflect back the truth. This creates what Jung called projection withdrawal. When people can no longer successfully project their shadow onto you, they're forced to confront it themselves. This is deeply uncomfortable for unconscious people, which explains why your transformation often triggers intense reactions from others. Some people will hate you for this mirroring effect. They'll call you cold, changed, or crazy. Jung understood this reaction perfectly. He wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But most people prefer irritation to understanding. Others will be drawn to your transformation like moths to flame. They sense something different about you, a quality of presence that feels both magnetic and dangerous." Jung called this the numinous effect, when archetypal energy becomes visible in human form. If people started treating you differently after your transformation, comment, "My energy shifted," and everyone felt it. But the most profound effect happens with other empaths, still trapped in narcissistic dynamics. Your very existence becomes proof that escape is possible, that transformation is real, that they don't have to remain psychological prisoners forever. Jung identified a paradox in psychological development. True power comes not from controlling others, but from controlling yourself so completely that others cannot control you. The transformed empath embodies this paradox perfectly. They become incredibly powerful precisely because they no longer need power over others. They've discovered what Jung called the treasure hard to attain: complete self-possession. Jung wrote, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." The transformed empath embodies this principle completely. Their boundaries aren't threats or ultimatums. They're simply reality. They don't announce their limits, they live them. This creates what I call paradoxical magnetism. The more self-contained you become, the more others are drawn to you. The less you need their approval, the more they seek yours. The less available you are for their emotional dumping, the more they respect your boundaries. Jung wrote, "Where love reigns, there is no will to power. And where the will to power is paramount, love is lacking." The transformed empath has transcended the will to power through love, but love of self first. This self-love isn't narcissistic. It's what Jung called appropriate self-regard, the foundation of all healthy relationships. You can only give to others what you possess yourself, and the transformed empath possesses something rare: unshakable self-worth. Jung observed, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life." The empath who has survived narcissistic abuse has been forced into radical self-acceptance, not the comfortable kind, but the kind forged in fire. But here's where the paradox becomes profound. By refusing to be anyone's emotional dumping ground, you become available for authentic connection in ways you never were before. By saying no to manipulation, you create space for genuine love. Jung wrote, "Even a happy life cannot be without a measure of darkness," and the word happy would lose its meaning if it were not balanced by sadness. The transformed empath understands this balance viscerally. They can hold space for others' darkness without absorbing it into their own system. You become what Jung called a container, but now you're a conscious container with clear boundaries, not an unconscious sponge soaking up everyone's psychological waste. Jung identified that some individuals are called to what he termed the guardian function, protecting others from psychological predators through their very existence. The transformed empath often embodies this guardian archetype, not through aggressive confrontation, but through impenetrable boundaries that serve as a model for others. Jung wrote, "To ask the right question is already half the solution of a problem." Your boundaries become the question that forces others to examine their own psychological patterns. You become what I call a boundary beacon, living proof that psychological sovereignty is achievable. Other empaths see your transformation and begin to believe their own freedom is possible. This guardian function operates through what Jung called morphic resonance. Your consciousness level literally lifts the consciousness of those around you. You don't have to do anything except be authentically yourself. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But the transformed empath's reactions are now conscious choices, rather than unconscious compulsions. You choose which chemical reactions to participate in based on what serves your highest good, rather than what others need from you. This selectivity isn't cruelty, it's consciousness. Jung understood that indiscriminate giving is often unconscious addiction to being needed rather than genuine compassion. Jung observed, life really does begin at 40. Up until then, you are just doing research. For many empaths, this research phase includes decades of unconscious absorption patterns. The transformation represents graduation from research into conscious living. You become a guardian not through preaching or teaching, but through embodiment. Jung wrote, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity." Your transformed presence creates new possibilities in others simply because you exist as proof that authentic selfhood is possible. You don't need to convince anyone. Your very being becomes the argument for psychological freedom. Jung warned about what he called the integration trap, the danger of identifying so completely with your transformation that you become rigid in the opposite direction. Some transformed empaths swing from being completely porous to being completely closed off. They mistake hardness for strength and isolation for protection. But true integration, what Jung called the union of opposites, means maintaining both your empathy and your boundaries, your openness and your discernment, your compassion and your standards. The goal isn't to stop feeling, it's to feel consciously. Jung wrote, "Emotion, which is suffering, ceases to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture of it." The integrated empath feels everything, but is consumed by nothing. They can witness another's pain without absorbing it, offer support without sacrificing themselves, love deeply without losing themselves. This balance is delicate and requires what Jung called constant vigilance. The old patterns of absorption and codependence will attempt to resurface, especially during stress or vulnerability. But once you've tasted psychological freedom, you can never truly go back to unconscious servitude. Your psyche has been rewired at too deep a level. Jung believed that individual transformation inevitably creates collective transformation. He wrote, "The individual is the only reality." The further we move away from the individual towards abstract ideas, the more likely we are to fall into error. The transformed empath creates what I call consciousness ripples. Their individual freedom gives others permission to seek their own freedom. This happens without preaching.